All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm really happy to have you here today to listen to this awesome webinar. I was trying to see how many participants there are, but it looks like that's not part of my view. So out there, however many of you there are. Um, so I'm Dr. Josh Iyer. I'm the chair of the Health Research Council, and I want to thank you for joining us for the DEI Principles and Practice in Psychology Undergraduate and Graduate Education. It's hosted by the Society for Health Psychology's Health Research Council and co-sponsored by the Society of Clinical Psychology, APA Division 12, and we also have Education and Training Council represented here today, which I'll tell you more about in a minute. Before we begin, we have a few items to share. First, this and all society virtual presentations are offered as a free benefit of membership in the Society for Health Psychology. Please invite your colleagues and students to join to ensure unlimited access to future presentations and other society benefits. You can visit our website at societyforhealthpsychology.org for more information. This event is being recorded. Anyone who speaks during it, for example, to ask a question, is agreeing to be recorded and is granting permission for the recording to be posted on our website. The webinar is also eligible for one continuing education credit under the Society of Clinical Psychology, Division 12 sponsorship. CE evaluation information will be sent via email to all who attend the full presentation shortly after the webinar. We will leave the evaluation portal open for 1 week until 5 o'clock Eastern on Friday, March 29th, 2024. CE certificates will be sent via email within 5 to 10 business days after the evaluation period closes, using the email at which you enrolled in this session. All participants are invited to submit feedback via the evaluation, even those not seeking credit. Questions will be taken at the end of the presentation. You may submit them via the chat feature during the presentation. A moderator will call on you at the end to unmute and ask your question. All right, that moderator will be Maria. So let me introduce who's here today talking to y'all. We are going to have Natasha Ramanyake. I actually should have asked you how to say that. Sorry if I said it wrong. And Catherine Kozak. I'm hosting, so you'll see me at the beginning. And then we have Maria Anastasiadis. Is that right, Maria? Close enough? Who will be moderating at the end, taking your questions and helping structure the discussion that we have after this. All right. So the objectives for the webinar today are to describe and outline an understanding of the research, or upon completion, you'll be able to describe and outline an understanding of the research principles underlying the centrality of DEI topics in health psychology education and training. And you'll be able to assess, analyze, and select appropriate strategies for experiential learning on DEI topics in health psychology education and training. We have with us today Dr. Ramanayake.
Ramanayaka.
Ramanayaka.
Yeah.
Not even close. Okay, Ramanayaka. Thank you. Who is a licensed clinical psychologist working at Christian Care in Delaware as a consult liaison health psychologist. She received her PhD in clinical psychology from Suffolk University and also holds degrees from Boston University, Columbia University, and Yeshiva University. Her clinical interests include health psychology and serious mental illness. Her research interests include mental and physical health disparities, as well as developing trainings in diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's so great to have you today. We also have Dr. Kozak, who is a researcher, activist, coach, and consultant who helps others develop habits, attitudes, and ways of life that are in line with socially just principles and values. Catherine completed a doctorate in applied developmental psychology at Suffolk University with research focusing on service learning, pedagogy, civic education, and community engagement. Catherine is also a certified organizational coach, level one through the Institute of Executive Coaching and Leadership. She offers executive coaching and consulting services with focuses on nonprofit leadership, program assessment, curriculum development, and youth leadership development. We're so happy to have you as well. So I mentioned myself, I'm the chair of the Health Research Council. I'm the director of the Southern Regional Drug Data Research Center at the University of Alabama. And moderating, we have Dr. Maria I said it wrong again. Anastasiades. Is that close? Okay.
You
So
got
many
it.
syllables for me. Like I have ire. It makes it very much harder for me when I go to say your names. She is the vice chair of the Education and Training Council, and I'm so glad to have you here today, Margaret. Also works at the Baptist Medical Center in Jacksonville, Florida. Okay, y'all. So this webinar came from the HRC as part of our effort to increase the amount of diversity, equity, and inclusion programming for the society, and that is in response to a charge from the long range plan. I've listed here multiple goals and what we've been assigned to do. So we talked about this in our council, and we came up with a strategy that's got 3 prongs on how we're going to promote more DEI or EDI programming in the division. So the 3 prongs that we think are really important are best practices. So sharing best practices for engaging health psychology research that is attentive to EDI considerations. Number 2 would be rigorous evaluation. So promoting research that uses rigorous methods to evaluate and refine EDI initiatives and interventions. And then number 3 is amplifying health psychology research that addresses inequities in health, work, and society. So we've got a number of activities that we do, and we've woven that into many of our activities, especially over this year, but in the past and moving into the future. The first of these is why you're here today. It's the webinars. So this one started out as programming at APA convention last year, and it was part of a symposium, so they got a shorter amount of time. We really they did such a great job. And so we talked about it, and we were thinking about like how to promote this programming, and it immediately came up that one of the things that we could do is give them an hour to expand on the great work that they presented at the convention. So we're so happy to be doing that today. We also are working on another webinar coming up in June about provider flourishing and burnout, so keep an eye out for that. We do a number of types of member programming. That includes the Publicizing Recent Research series, where each month one of our members summarizes a health psychology research article, and those really often have DEI elements to it. Another is the research highlight in the Health Psychologist, and actually the article for this upcoming edition is actually, there's 2 things. There's a research corner that we're doing, and then also an article that we're publishing that I wrote about this strategy and how we're going to promote this programming in the division. Those research highlights often also have an EDI component. Another resource that we have is the repository of health disparity related literature that we're looking to update this year. It's work to keep it current, but we think that's important work to do. And there's 5 tips for improving equity and health-related research that we produced in collaboration with the Society's Diversity and Inclusion Officer, Dr. Tanisha Blue, and you can find that on the Society's YouTube channel. We are also continuing every year to promote, to propose convention programming. This year, it's Where is DEI Going? The Future of Evidence-Based EDI Programs. And we, in the interest of promoting rigor, that programming, which we recently found out was accepted, is going to promote evaluation frameworks. It's going to tell you what the evaluation frameworks might be, and then look at some cutting edge research related to EDI interventions and how we can tailor those to people where they are. That's some great work that Jonathan Cantor is doing with one of our members, Amanda Allman. And then finally, but definitely not least there, we administer the Graduate Research Awards for the Society. So we take the nominations, we do the reviews, and we choose the winners. And there are 6 awards, and one of them is always chosen for Research Addressing Health Disparities Award. And then in 2019, we added a research award to promote inclusion. So those are 2 ways that through the research awards, we've also tried to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in the society, especially with relation to health inequities and also inequities in the makeup of the members. So aiming towards the future. That's everything I have to tell you about the HRC's efforts. Thank you so much for listening to that. And now, without any further talking, I will hand it off to our great speakers and Maria, who will come back in at the end. Take it away, y'all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So my name is Catherine Kozak. I am based in Jersey City, New Jersey, but I'm coming at you from Boston. I'm here visiting family in a lovely co-working space. And Dr. Ramanayak and I are so excited to be able to have this conversation. We love talking about DEI. We love talking about how to be able to expand the work that we're doing, to have the content and structure to add nuance and complexity to our work in a way that makes the world a better place. That's everything to me is, are we making the world a better place at the end of the day? So I love when my Zoom controls aren't where I expect them to be, but that's okay. I think I can see most of what I need to see. And hopefully you see my screen. So, nope, I keep ruining it. That's okay. So some expectations to set up to kind of level set for our presentation today is starting with assuming best intentions. So we are all here to learn. We are all here to hopefully get something out of this. DEI can be a complicated subject. And so the idea here is that everybody's here with the intention of learning something. And along those lines, I hope that everyone here commits to thinking differently about something, about the work that they're doing, about what DEI means. I do, again, encourage you to use the chat function if it's appropriate for you, with the understanding that it will be potentially available, but share thoughts, share questions. I'm pretty good at moderating chats while facilitating things. So Natasha and I will be watching. So please, comments, questions, etc., are great to put in the chat. And then we will hold some time at the end for folks who will be able to ask questions. And finally, in terms of expectations, write down key learnings and inspiration. I hope that you have a paper and pen or something available next to you so that as inspiration strikes, you can write it down, something that you want to learn more about, something that you'd like to incorporate, so that this is, the plan is to take this outside of this webinar and back into your work. So I want to start with a prompt for you. What does DEI mean to you? I encourage you to take a moment to think about it, put it in the chat. We're talking about an acronym, diversity, equity, and inclusion. But what does this mean to you? What are your first kind of reactions or thoughts? And I will make space if one or two folks would like to come off of mute and share, what does DEI mean to you? Openness, appreciation that everyone has a different background, thinking of health disparities, making the world better, person-centered equity, fairness, person-centered care, health equity, fairness, advocacy, leveling the playing field to make things fair. These are some incredible responses, and I appreciate all of them. And hopefully we're also seeing that everybody has like a slightly different approach to DEI based off of the things that are important to us. As health psychologists, oftentimes we think about health disparities in particular. I come from a developmental background, although I have co-presented with Dr. Ramanayaka in sort of health psychology specific topics. I've taught health psychology courses, but it's interesting for me, I'm always coming at this from how can we make the world a better place? How do we use our work to make the world a better place? But keeping in mind that everyone's going to have their own sort of slant on this depending on their orientation, their experiences, etc. So in this presentation, it's principles and practice. So we'll start by talking a little bit about principles of DEI in our training, our education, et cetera, with this focus on health psychology. And then we'll talk about practice. What does this look like when we're crafting syllabi, when we're leading course discussions, and ultimately when we're engaging in clinical training and supervision. So to kind of briefly cover some key research about why this is important, why we talk about this, graduate level training in clinical psychology has opportunities to enrich DEI curricula. Like this is a core part of becoming a good psychologist. And APA's guidelines for multiculturally competent services is not just about the kind of clinical work. This is extended to our education, our training, everything that we're doing as psychologists should be multiculturally competent. And while health psychology is a really common course that's offered in a lot of undergraduate institutions as part of their psychology programs, unfortunately, a lot of them are lacking in terms of DEI material. I know I have struggled to choose health psychology textbooks because a lot of them, in my experience, lack nuance or are using narratives about health issues that do not align with my approach to some of these issues. And, as the sort of narratives are shifting around how we talk about different things, it's important that we're keeping up with that when we are teaching about health and psychology issues. And like, this is incredibly important because DEI makes us better instructors. It makes us better supervisors when we are attuned to a diversity of perspectives, when we are focused on equity in healthcare, in the world in general, and when we are taking an inclusive approach, we provide higher quality instruction. And we're able to reach students and include students in the field in a way that's really important for helping stop up gaps in the major to mental health workforce pipeline. And so where can we use DEI? And I use this really broadly. There will be plenty of space to kind of interrogate that a little bit. But when we're talking about like, what are we trying to actually do? And there are a few key places where we can integrate this into our coursework and our training. So when we talk about the history of psychology and health psychology, it's really important to break outside of these narratives to kind of critically interrogate, like, why have certain conditions been studied the way that they have? Why have certain voices been represented? Why do our programs look the way that they do? Why do we as psychologists work in certain settings and not others, particularly in the United States? That's a great place. Like, we're already starting to consider like diversity and inclusion just by thinking about history in a different way, as well as the ways that we talk about culturally adapted treatment. That it is not, in my opinion, particularly inclusive if we talk about like, here's your gold standard. And then if you're not white, middle class, US American English speaking, then these are some other things that you can tailor. How can we talk about the development of treatments and culturally adapted treatments in a way that is being inclusive of all experiences? And even then, like most of the things I'm talking about are from a US American perspective. And even that is to the exclusion of other global experiences and perspectives. Disparities in care is something that a lot of folks in the chat are really concerned about. And some of the classic narratives in health psychology about disparities and social determinants of health are, we have all these people and they don't access services and we don't know why, and we have to fix that. Well, when we talk to those people, they tell us why. They tell us about barriers. They tell us about the ways they've been excluded. And so shifting this narrative around health disparities towards understanding the structures is a really great way of enhancing the education and the training that we're giving to students. And finally, representation, thinking about representation differently. In my experiences, in my own training, representation often was like, how do we include voices from other psychologists who aren't just white men, for example? But representation also means including patient voices and patient advocates and folks from groups that typically don't have power or authority or expertise within health and psychology. So we'll talk a lot about what that actually looks like. And so as we shift, I would love if folks could take a moment to reflect on a scale from 1 to 100. How important is it to you, where 1 is not at all important and 100 is like your top priority, to integrate principles of DEI into your work as a clinical psychologist, as a health psychologist, as a psychologist in general? And so I'll pause here and let that percolate for just a moment. So I love 100 in theory, 80 in practice. That's really, really great awareness because we can hold it as being the most important thing, but we recognize that like it's really important to recognize that that's not always logistically possible, right? Like we have other things in our lives or other pressures. So that we can all sit here and say, this is like the most important thing to me being a good clinician. Um, but that maybe there are other things that take top priority. I love somebody commenting in the chat, 85 given other pressures. And this, I think, is a really important thing from my experience, is that acknowledging those other pressures is the first step towards being able to actually do something about it. So continuing to kind of think and reflect in the chat here, but it seems like a lot of folks here are sort of at that like 80 to 85, like this is really, really important. In the context of many other important things in our lives and in our work. So I want to start by giving some kind of like tangible tips, because I find with DEI, it's hard sometimes to like what do people actually do? And so my approach is thinking both about structure and content, because we have to be able to, it's not just about talking about DEI to our students. How do we incorporate these principles in the courses themselves? So for example, in your syllabus, I highly recommend starting with an analytical framework. As a clinician, you probably had to write a theoretical orientation essay at some point where you were talking really deeply about like what orientation is important to you. What's the theory behind that? Where does that come from? Well, thinking about that is also really important for your DEI work, both to make sure that you have a clear understanding of why this is important, but also to help scaffold for your students and your trainees so that they can learn and understand. So I recommend using, for example, Prelitensky's model of wellness, or I love good old-fashioned Bronfenbrenner, especially coming from a developmental perspective. This is really, really great for helping critically evaluate work. So helping your students like dig into, okay, so when we're talking about, for example, lifestyle recommendations, where does the individual fit into this? What's the microsystem? What's the, thinking, goodness gracious, about COVID? What's the chronosystem around talking about the COVID and the coronavirus? How different were those conversations 4 years ago versus now? So having that and using that same framework throughout the semester, throughout a course, helps you stay sort of oriented towards the kind of critical evaluation and helps teach your students how to do it as well. And importantly, if you're coming from other anti-racist or feminist approaches, those are great places to include that as well. This is about making sure that you have a clear grounding and that you're teaching your students how to have that grounding as well. I will also say it's so important to walk the walk. We can teach about DEI, and if that's not reflected in your syllabus policies, then like there's a big mismatch there. So this looks like honoring disability accommodations. I've heard from a lot of students that are scared to bring paperwork to professors, or have professors said like, I'll sign this, but I'm not actually going to do it, which is horrifying to me. Don't be that professor. Be the one that is really, be warm, be gracious, be empathetic. If you haven't had to file for disability accommodations yourself, it can be this big mystical thing. And it's a big hurdle for students just to be able to participate in a course or in a program. Another practical tip is making sure that all of your course materials are compatible with e-readers for students that might be visually impaired. Put your PowerPoint presentations through software or their websites to check to make sure that your fonts and your color patterns, color schemes are accessible to folks with color blindness or low vision impairment. Making sure that you're doing this in the beginning means that students aren't going to have to come ask you for it. And then if a student does ask you for it, it's already there and you don't have to go back through all of your readings and make sure that the PDFs are going to be accessible. Explore flexible attendance and assignment submission options. A lot of us as instructors are very principled when it comes to things like deadlines and assignments and attendance, and we have reasons for that. Unfortunately, I think we also can become really punitive with things like deadlines and attendance policies. So thinking about what is it that I want to teach my students or model for them that's built into my syllabus policies, and how do I follow through with that? Am I actually helping them learn how to complete projects, how to be respectful of other people's time, how to do things, how to manage a project, for example, versus punishment because I don't want to have to do 30 papers 2 days before grades close. That's an important thing for us to interrogate for ourselves. And a good tip in my experience for adjusting this is see what students have trouble with historically. Do you get a lot of emails from students about a specific issue with their papers? Do you have a lot of students filing accommodations around a specific thing? That can help point you in the direction of what tweaks you can make to your syllabus, because an accessible course is one that doesn't require a lot of accommodations for your students. It is music to my ears when students come to me and say, hey, I've got these accommodations that I need you to sign the paperwork, but I don't think I'm actually going to need to use it because it's covered in your policies. That means that my course is accessible to that student. And so finally, considering supplemental materials in your syllabus, this is not only helping us represent a diversity of perspectives in the content we're teaching, it also helps for folks with a diversity of learning styles and experiences. So including things like interviews, podcasts, video clips, excerpts from memoirs, including monographs, histories, is going to help students that might struggle with doing a lot of academic reading. It helps supplement the perspectives in your textbook. It helps teach students about analyzing different perspectives. It helps us have richer conversations. And honestly, Googling like sample syllabus for whatever, like these are really great ways. There are a lot of folks particularly invested in like anti-racist teaching that will share their syllabi, that have a lot of materials that can help model after if you're interested in other sort of approaches. There are a few things that it's useful to look out for when you're structuring your course. Ableist language, this is a little bit of a hot take, but if you're a psychologist, in my opinion, uncritically using the words insane or crazy or idiot or stupid, like those are words that are very, very loaded and very tied up in the history of psychology. And we can unintentionally communicate to students that we haven't taken the time to sort of understand that. Thinking about cis-heteronormative frames or culturally based ideas about family. Unfortunately, in my experience, a lot of textbooks still kind of have that, like, you know, in the way that we think about gender or sexual identity, the way that we think about education or family. So making sure that we're acknowledging differences there, as well as medicalizing language or, or unintentionally framing medical professionals as unerring experts. And I'm sure many other people in this webinar have unfortunately been harmed by medical professionals. And so making sure that we're helping our students understand how to interact with medical professionals, how to understand and honor expertise while also honoring an individual's experience. So approaching criticism and questions from students with curiosity and openness. And whenever there are those sort of moments of tension, asking yourself, what experiences are my students bringing or my trainees or my colleagues bringing that is informing their perspective, because that can help us avoid some of the the tension that can come up sometimes when there's those sort of differences in experience. And asking questions like, why are you bringing that into this conversation? Or what makes you want to ask that here can help kind of diffuse and move conversations in a productive direction. So I'd love for folks to share in the chat as we shift a little bit. What things have you done to make your syllabus accessible? What accommodations have you found that all students benefit from? And so as folks have a chance to sort of think about that and write it down, I'm going to shift to thinking a little bit about practice, because I want to leave lots of time for Natasha's vignettes and talking about the clinical piece, but I'm going to briefly talk a little bit about syllabi and curricula and some of the content that we can include to help incorporate principles of diversity to help make our courses more inclusive. So first, it can get really tricky when we're designing syllabi. We get stuck in this, like, there are there are term papers and there are reflections and like that's it. The text is a little small here, I apologize, but there's so many different things that we can have our students and our trainees do as assignments that are in line with their professional development, their career interests, their own learning styles and needs. Having them create an infographic and then write a paper about it, or having them write zines or record a podcast. It helps you have fewer term papers to grade and read, which is very nice, but it also is a really important way of including different experiences, different forms of information sharing, knowledge creation. Again, in academia, we get really into this, like the written word is like more important than anything else. But there's so many other culturally based ways of understanding knowledge and meaning making that can be helpful for assigning to our students and helping them learn about various topics. So a sample assignment, there's a video excerpt that I can share the link to, but I will not show it here. There's an internet creator, the King of Reads, who has a video responding to this question of who gave you HIV? And they talk about nobody gave me HIV, I contracted a virus. So it's a very short but powerful clip that is a completely different framing of HIV than I had ever heard in any books or histories or textbooks about the HIV and AIDS crisis in the United States. And so you can include this assignment because it provides an account of HIV from a person with HIV, which is a really big topic in a lot of health psychology and public health and clinical syllabi. It explores the role of stigma and medicalization in access to care, as well as the role of stigmatizing versus destigmatizing language. And this is a great activity to include if you're getting caught in the weeds of like person first language, and do we say disabled versus person with disability? And it's a really great clip from a person talking about their own experience and the way that they understand the sort of language and the more kind of socio-political components of this. What does this look like in your syllabus potentially? Well, you could have a class discussion with reflection prompts. You could assign an individual reflection, have them watch the video and then write a paragraph, it's homework or extra credit. You could have them write a comparison essay or a research paper using this as a jumping off point. You could have them write a critical reflection essay comparing this perspective to information in their textbooks or other assigned class readings. And for graduate students or trainees, you could have them think about in their own experiences and their own clinical training, where have they seen this type of language? How could they incorporate this into their clinical work? Another assignment that I love is, I call it avoiding ableist recommendations, but the cornerstone of a lot of health psychology and much of clinical psychology is lifestyle adjustments, right? It's always, a lot of it's diet and exercise. And so this is a way of like thinking outside the box. And what does an exercise recommendation mean to someone who doesn't have legs, for example? And so these are some resources on disability, ableism, body positivity, and exercise that you and your students can explore together. Or I've done this where I just sort of assign folks, they go into groups, they look through these websites and think about, what do these recommendations mean? How does this change the way that I think about disability or lifestyle recommendations? And this helps explore the role of ableism in lifestyle adjustment recommendations. It provides a disabled perspective on these recommendations, because it's not like, oh, they can't do exercise, we have to just figure something else out. Many disabled people can still exercise. And again, to bring in the long COVID stuff, people with post-exertional malaise, like that's another big thing. What does this mean to them and their lived experiences? And this also is a nice way of teaching students to consider other perspectives or experiences. We're modeling how to do this research, how to synthesize these things, and how to have these conversations. And again, this could look like a reflection paper. This could be a literature review or a jumping off point for a literature review, or you could do a role play. You could have them, based on these materials, have somebody role play being a patient and a counselor, for example. What does this look like? Create your own scenarios or vignettes. So finally, from me, this is a list of topics that, in my opinion, should give you pause. If it pops up in a textbook or your curriculum, your lecture notes, because the histories are so much more complex than we often see in the mainstream. Especially for those of us that are white, that are US, English-speaking folks, that we might not have a deeper or lived experience related to these things. So one that I'd like to highlight is the tobacco industrial complex and differential rates of nicotine use, the history of tobacco use. You may or may not know about the history of tobacco companies targeting urban, low income, Black and brown folks with particularly menthol cigarettes. And so understanding how different communities were targeted, basically given free samples that really had rates of tobacco and nicotine use and addiction much higher than other populations, as well as the inaccessibility of some nicotine cessation materials for folks that vape instead of other sort of sources of nicotine use. Every single class that I have taught, I've had at least one smoker who has asked to leave for smoke breaks, particularly during exams. And so the dissonance for those students, if I'm going on a whole lecture about how nicotine use is bad and smoking is bad, and it's an individual thing of, you have to do that before you can pursue other things, and then that student has to turn around and ask me for a smoke break. So it's really important. There are so many great resources for kind of opening up a conversation, or again, thinking outside the box of the traditional ways, potentially, of thinking about nicotine and tobacco use in a way that's going to help us work towards equity, these health disparities. The way that we talk about this, how might it be keeping people from accessing care? How might it be stigmatizing? And so making sure that we're being nuanced and open and evolving in the way we talk about these things, so that our students are learning in a way that is helping them to be good clinicians, good community members. So I'm going to turn it over to Natasha Ramanaika, PhD, to talk about clinical training and supervision, particularly within health psychology, particularly graduate settings with this eye towards DEI.
Thank you so much, Katie. And I apologize to everyone. I'm getting over a bit of a cough, so I sound a little bit hoarse. I've got my cough drops and I've got my liquids, so trying to stay hydrated and keep my throat clear. And I apologize for any coughing fits I go through. So I want to start just with a general question. Curious about DEI challenges that our group has faced. Across our roles as supervisors, when we were trainees, as clinicians, as academics. I'm sure we all have those stories one way or another. And if you want to share it in the chat, please feel free, if you feel comfortable to do so. Drop it in the chat and we can certainly talk about those themes. I do have a few examples that we can go through as well, where we can maybe role play a little bit and figure out what it will look like as supervisors, as clinicians, to deal with some DEI related challenges in the moment. While you're doing that, I also want to just start out with talking about terminology. There are so many different words we use to talk about DEI. We talk about DEI, even the structure of that phrase, diversity, equity, inclusion, changes according to institution, according to departments. At Christiana, where I work, and some of my colleagues are here on this call today, we have an inclusion and diversity team. I've heard it referred to as EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, because there's an emphasis on equity. When we talk about the evolution of these terms over time, we started out with cultural competence, and Daryl Sue and everything that he's done to, build this awareness out, talking about these major domains of assessment and knowledge and skill, or awareness and knowledge and skill. We have terms such as cultural humility that start to place emphasis on the idea of being open and curious rather than assuming a role as expert. And even developing, this new term of critical cultural competence, which includes anti-oppressive perspectives, valuing social action, meaning that we're encouraging awareness of our own intersectional identities within a supervisory relationship. Whatever terms you use, whether it's about cultural competence or cultural humility, or even picking a model of supervision that incorporates elements of DEI, or elements of intersectionality. The important thing is to pick a model, to pick a terminology, to pick a language that you're using, and to stay consistent with it, that you're remaining faithful to the frame that you've picked for how you're approaching intersectional considerations within supervision. I highly recommend for people who are interested in doing more reading about these different models and different options, this scoping review that was done by Tarshish and Baird back in 2021 has amazing overview of how we include intersectionality within supervision, and I think highlights how many different terms we use to address the incorporation of DEI principles within supervisory relationships. And just wanted to acknowledge some comments in the chat as well, in terms of challenges that people have faced. So anti-DEI legislation that suppresses how we teach, provide training, supervision, and research. Overt and covert racism in clinical care and written documentation, supervising trainees that may have intersectional identities, so trans trainees, what happens when our patients make negative comments. Absolutely, these are all important considerations. And as far as legislation issues go, I think I did see Ron somewhere on the list of participants here, and I know he's been working with APAC and the Diversity Inclusion Committee there to strategize about how we can support people who are in those states where there is anti-DEI legislation. So I don't know if I have all the answers for that, but it's certainly a place where we have the supports and the network among ourselves to have these conversations. When it comes to considerations for trainees, when it comes to training and didactic considerations, opportunities for regular self-assessment and reflection, that can be in individual supervision, it can be in group supervision. An activity that I often provide for trainees is having people identify maybe about 4 to 5 components of their identity or components of who they are as individuals that are important to them. So for example, I might pick my identity as a woman, as a Sri Lankan American, as a psychologist, as a cat mom, and to list and discuss and share these in a group setting or in a supervision setting, and to talk about why you pick each of these 5 words or 5 identities that are important to you, and then randomly to take away one of those identities and to talk about what it means to no longer have that label attached to you. And it provides context, it provides the opportunity to empathize and reflect on what it means to have these visible and invisible identities that may not always get seen or honored or addressed in clinical settings. In terms of having opportunities, oh, sorry, I'm still on the trainees. In terms of knowledge, providing opportunities to learn about intersectional identities, to build structural conceptualizations. Jonathan Metzel wrote this really great article where he advocates for a structural conceptualization of a patient. When you're doing your, usual medical presentation, patient is a 30-something-year-old South Asian woman with a past medical history of blah, blah, blah. Also including those social determinants of health so that we're providing context for the health problems that our patients are experiencing. And then also making sure we offer opportunities for skills. So this may be ensuring that trainees have the opportunity to work with people of different identities that are intersectionally diverse, that there are resources to provide adaptive care. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Or how can you learn from a more homogenized population? So what privileges we might experience by working with a patient population that unfortunately it has one sort of major identity that defines it. I also want to make sure we talk about assessment. Data collection, data is important. We collect data all the time. We are scientists, practitioners. That's what we do. It's not just for record keeping. It's not just for APA accreditation. We utilize data to inform treatment, right? We conduct clinical trials. We, administer measures to our patients to see how they're progressing over time. Making sure that there is quantitative and qualitative data measurement so that it's not just a number, right? We can't just do something like the IAT. This happened in a clinic that I worked in where we were told to all take the IAT to see how biased we were. right? There's no number or label that we can put on that. We can't say this is how racist you are. But qualitative assessment allows for critical self-reflection. It allows us to encourage our trainees to look at themselves and examine themselves the same way that we might encourage a patient to engage in journaling for their own reflection on thoughts and behaviors. For supervisors, this is the part that's so important. Accountability. First and foremost, accountability. So understanding that we as supervisors, as clinicians who provide training, that there is the potential for us to make mistakes. That's part of who we are as humans. To say that we might not err, that we are perfectly expert, I think gives us no room to examine ourselves, to be curious, to be open, to reflect, in the same way that Katie was talking about earlier. And recognizing that not being able to take accountability allows for trainees to feel less inclined to bring issues to supervision. We may have a impact on patient care if a trainee is not bringing questions to supervision, then they may have patient issues that may not be getting appropriately addressed. And I think also just in terms of maintaining transparency, where we are right now in DEI training is that there has been a whole wealth of research of exploration of model building over the last several years that may not have existed when all of us were in training ourselves. And what's happened, at least within, I think, the last 5 years, I would say, is that we have a lot of trainees training supervisors, which on the one hand works in that we all get the learning and we all get the experience. And what would it mean to be open and to say, we might not have all the answers. We might not have all of the solutions, and we're learning alongside you. And here's the learning that we're doing, right? That training for us may involve doing our own self-assessment, doing our own self-reflection. It may be that as a training site or a training program, we have a model of supervision that we all agree to participate in together. We're all going to engage in feminist multicultural supervision, that we are all going to reflect and update that DEI training plan for ourselves year after year. We're going to make sure we stay up to date with the latest research that's available. Engaging in assessment the same way that trainees do. How do we incorporate that into supervision as well? So that gets into the next slide where we talk about how to have these conversations. How do we talk with trainees where, Sarah's mentioning supervising a trainee where there are offensive comments made by patients, or a parent of a patient made offensive comments, or a patient makes an offensive comment. I really like the Brave Spaces model. I think it allows for a set of expectations, just as Katie included when we started this conversation today. Rules or guidelines, whatever it is you choose, pick a model and stick with it. But allowing for controversy with civility, being able to own the difference between intention and impact, being able to come into a conversation with respect. So important. Also, in terms of having these conversations, how do we solicit feedback? So how do we offer opportunities, right? It might be difficult for a trainee to say in the moment, I think you screwed up. I think this was really difficult. So thinking about the modes of delivery, you might want to make sure that there's a lot of different options available. It might be face-to-face. It might be that there's an anonymous survey. It might be that they go back to their training director, or it might be that they're sharing it with another person within the program to then share with you. Making sure that you have ways to honor confidentiality, especially with programs with smaller amounts of trainees, that there's a way to make sure it's anonymous and that there's transparency around addressing those missteps. Acknowledging when an issue has been raised and how you address it with them in a way that allows for you to take accountability and for that person to feel heard and respected. In terms of training spaces, so just as Katie said, and a situation or syllabi that allows for a student to not have to ask for accommodation. So important. This goes doubly for a training situation. So physical space, that might be for patients, making sure that there is accessible seating. It might be making sure that visual materials have representation. It might be making sure that you have training materials for your students that are that include more than just white male perspectives, that you have BIPOC authors available. For clinic procedures, making sure that your services are accessible. So that might be pro bono or sliding scale where possible, building in extra time around an appointment for someone with transportation issues. I always think about someone who came to my clinic with cystic fibrosis and took 15 minutes just to get into the room. Patient population, that your patient population at least matches the demographics of the region. That services are accessible, and that the clinic is accessible. So making sure that students who need disability accommodations are able to ask for it, and that you have enough time in advance to prepare so that they're not coming in on your first day of practicum or internship or postdoc and nothing is in place. And then representation. So working on moving towards a greater representation, whether it's having supervisors of diverse identities or making sure that that your trainees are connected to other people with those diverse identities within the healthcare system. So I recognize we're running short on time, and so I want to make sure we get to some of these examples. So this is an example, something that actually happened to me. And I'm not saying there's any right or wrong answers to any of this, but this is what happened to me, that I was a trainee. I was the only BIPOC, visibly BIPOC member of this group. And another group member was talking about concerns of navigating a group therapy situation with a Black patient that she described as angry, as hostile, unwilling to follow the rules. The entire supervision session was devoted to discussing this patient. How dare she disrespect the rules? What were the policies and procedures in place for kicking her out of the group? At one point, one of the other group members raises concern about some stereotypes at play. And ultimately the group says, we need to kick her out. If she's not going to play by the rules of the group, we need to kick her out. During this discussion, you as a supervisor notice your trainee is clearly upset and disengaging from the group. Just with that information alone, if you were the supervisor in that situation, how might you address it? Would you have any concerns? Would you have any thoughts about what you would want to raise, what you would not want to raise? And in what way would you do it? Again, no right or wrong answers.
We want people to unmute to respond.
People can absolutely unmute if they want to respond that way. That might be easier than typing up a response.
I think that I would have a lot of concerns, but I wouldn't necessarily know about when to talk about them or how to talk about them.
So when and how, I think, Josh, are such great considerations, right? Is this something that you bring up in the group itself, as Marie is noting? Is this something that you bring up one-on-one? Is this, when you think about the when of it as well? So this happened on a Friday, and I got an email from the supervisor in question on a Saturday, when I was already sitting with, processing what had happened and how I wanted to address it. So thinking about, are you going to say something in an email? Are you going to wait until the next supervision session? It might be that as a supervisor, right, it's hard to say without knowing the greater context, or the context of each individual instance, how you would respond. But as a supervisor, you might establish expectations in the beginning of the training year to start out a first or second session and say, we might have instances where the relationship is ruptured, or I make a misstep, or something happens where I am not serving you or working with you in the way that you would like. And so how would you prefer to address it in that time? And if you have an opportunity for shared decision-making in that moment, you can kind of prepare for eventual missteps and say, so it might be, as we agreed, if there was something where we disagreed or I was concerned about letting you down in some way, we said that I would wait until individual supervision. And so here we are in individual supervision, and here's what I was noticing, and what did you think about it? Right? Not necessarily prescribing any feelings to your trainee, not necessarily enforcing them to discuss with you when they might not feel ready. It might be that you're giving them the space to, you might encourage them to speak to another member in the clinic or another supervisor. Very luckily for me, I had another supervisor that I did feel comfortable sharing with. And so the three of us kind of worked together to work through this particular issue. But making sure that you establish expectations at the outset of your training relationship of how you might address missteps, recognizing that it's not sort of a one-size-fits-all template. The next scenario that I have, and please go ahead and enter questions in as we go through. So this was a scenario, again, real scenario. So this was a patient who was here in the hospital for a prolonged stay. I started working with him about a year after he was first hospitalized. He really struggled with managing his emotions. He would lash out at staff, he'd throw things. And so he had a behavior contract implemented, and I started working with him, to help manage these behaviors and to help manage prolonged hospitalization. And I had a trainee working with me who would see him once a week for, brief therapy within an inpatient setting. He one day became very upset over the weekend, lashing out, throwing things, cursing, using racist language. And because he had violated this behavior contract he had put in place, he lost all of his privileges. So he wasn't able to order food to his room. He wasn't able to have outside visitors. And because psychology is an optional service in my hospital, he potentially had the ability to lose psychology services and working with the intern. So if you were in my position as a supervisor and your intern, who was a young woman of color, was working with this patient, what might you anticipate wanting to do with your intern? What conversations might you have with the patient? What would you do, basically? And again, no right or wrong answers. And also acknowledging that, I can certainly share what I ended up doing, knowing that it might not have been the right thing to do, but it was what I did at the time. And feel free to unmute yourselves as well.
Yeah, we're at the end of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and read the closing remarks, but I'm sure y'all are able to stay around for a few minutes for questions. Is that right? Great. All right, so thank you for attending the webinar today. Remember, if you'd like CE credit for attending this event, please respond promptly to the evaluation link, which will be sent via email shortly. We'll leave the evaluation open until Friday, March 29th. CE certificates will be sent via email within 5 to 10 business days after the evaluation period closes. And remember, you're encouraged to submit an evaluation, even if not seeking credit. Feel free to email us at apadiv38@verizon.net if you have any questions. And guys, thank you so much. That was such wonderful content. And if anybody has questions, please hang out or put it in the chat because we're here for another few minutes.